Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm very excited today to talk to you about this cutting edge research. But first, I want to give you a little bit of background because I'm sure that this topic is even crazier than the last speaker we had, the knowledge about after the end of the world. So this research started with a failed grant application with the DFG, the Deutsche Forschungsgesellschaft, that said that my idea for doing research into the ideological impact of science fiction was not political science-y enough. So I got so angry, I somehow ended up in an alternate universe where I met a professor named Uwe Mann. He's a professor at the Institute for Speculation into the Queer and Unusual in Environments of Knowledge. If you haven't heard of it, it's because it only exists in this alternate universe. For those of you who are very sciencey and understand alternate parallel universes, it's alternate universe number 23. Our planet Earth is on universe 16. But it was very nice that I met Professor Uwe Mann because he had just collected some really interesting data from the planet Uranus, and he needed a social scientist to help him understand it, make sense of it. And it really tied very nicely into my failed attempt with the DFG to look into the role of speculative fiction in promoting ideological and political change. So that gives you a bit of some background on where this research is coming from. It is very cutting edge because I'm still doing a lot of the analysis right now. I had to translate the texts that I looked at from Uranian into English, but I'll get more into that as the presentation progresses. So first, some background on the planet Uranus. So I'm sure all of you have heard of the planet Uranus. It is the 7th planet from the sun in our solar system, in this universe, as well as all alternate parallel universes, at least that I'm aware of. It's known as an ice giant, mostly because of its cold atmosphere. It has traces of water and hydrocarbons. Depending on the time of year, it's between 2.6 billion and 3.2 billion kilometers from the Earth, which means it's very difficult for us to study, right? So for me as a political scientist used to doing field research, I can't just travel to Uranus for a couple months and do field work. Instead, I have to base my work on video and audio material as well as photos that come directly back from our satellites. What we have learned in the research that we've done is actually Uranus is inhabited. There are currently about 2.5 billion Uranians. I've been able to identify at least 73 languages together with some linguists I've been working with. Politically, they live on 42 countries on 3 continents. And what's most interesting, and particularly for this talk, is there are at least 12 species of Uranians we would consider sentient. Okay, so they have thought, they have language, they have an understanding of identity. Beyond these 12 species, there's a diverse range of hydrogen and carbon-based life forms. It's quite a biodiverse planet. I doubt, because as far as I know, in this universe, Uranus is not populated, which is why this research is really the first of its kind that I'm aware of that's coming up with this sociological data on the residents of Uranus in this other universe. So some historical context to set the scene of why should we care about drag utopias on another planet in a different universe, in a reality that we don't even live in, right? Well, when I was looking into kind of the history of Uranus, I saw that some of the context politically is very similar to what we have here on planet Earth. So in the early 32,000s, and this is my son who is a bit sad that he can't be up with me on the platform. In the early 32,000s, centuries of prosperity that we had seen on Uranus started to hit a turning point. Prosperity gave way to overproduction, which then led to resource scarcity. Does that sound familiar? Does that sound like maybe the reason we're here, right? That resource scarcity is starting to lead to changes that make us worried about the end of the world. So really fundamentally what this research that I'm doing is all about is trying to prevent that end of the world from happening by looking at how positive visions can change our world for the better. But now, this resource scarcity is only one of 3 factors that I noticed on Uranus. The second factor is rising social inequality, okay, in which we have fears of job loss, and we see Uranians particularly worried about losing their jobs to other species. This might also sound a little familiar. Here are also parallels to the Earth that we live on today. And finally, there's a third trend of increased interspeciality. So this means multi-species Uranians, because of high mobility, because of cosmopolitan values, that there was a lot of interspecies breeding. And this led to new questions about what does it mean to be a Uranian? What does it mean to have different species identities? Do I have to then identify as all the species I belong to, et cetera, et cetera? As well as, this is kind of on one side of the coin, on the other side of the coin, the question of species dilution. Are we going to lose pure forms of individual species, and if so, is that a problem? So you see these 3 historical trends on Uranus make it uniquely interesting to study in the context of Earth as we see it now. So what I looked at in particular is the emergence of drag utopias. And I call these drag utopias because what they fundamentally are is interspecies performers who take on additional species roles beyond their own. So it's not drag in the terms that you might understand it of gender performance. Instead, it's species performance. So in 32,100, which was an auspicious year on Uranus, a tri-species hybrid named Anna Burdois started performing interspecies drag. And she was really the first Uranian to come up with this idea of drag. And she became really a model and kind of a mother figure for many of these other drag performers. You will notice in the photo, I can't see down there, but I hope you can see it clearly enough, that she has drag on of at least 6 different species. So it's hard to tell which 3 species she actually belongs to and which additional species are part of her drag. And this is what makes her so interesting as a performer. She did a lot of performing and a lot of mentoring work for younger drag performers, and many of her followers became not only performers, but they also got involved in fiction, in writing. And before I'm going to give you sketches of 3 of these drag performers who are some of Anna Burdois' acolytes, but I really want to thank here Trans Animalia. Trans Animalia is a Uranian drag performer and historical photographer. She's taken artist photos of all of the drag performers I'm going to show you. If you're interested, her work is curated here on this planet Earth by Yannick Van Veen at yannickvanveen.com. So the first work I want to talk about is written by Über in the year 32,167. Über was a social activist and shell collector who's passionate about biodiversity. And what Über noticed is the number and types of shells over time was decreasing. And so she became very, very interested in protecting and promoting biodiversity. And she did this through a work that I translated as BLT. Now, a second note on the translation. As I said, all of the works that I'm looking at and that I'm talking about today, they were written in Uranian or translated into Uranian because I don't have the time to learn 72 other languages on a foreign planet. And I have done my best to translate them all into English, including a cultural translation, so that they can make sense in our cultural moment. And you'll see what I mean in a second. But so BLT was a serialized radio drama that focused on a group of blue-skinned lessons who killed the wealthiest Uranians to protect the planet. So the core of this radio drama is a political idea of an inheritance tax that taxed the wealthiest Uranians in order to promote biodiversity. These women, mostly these lessons, who formed this group, they were then branded as BLT, which we can translate, perhaps, to black lesbian terrorists. What this led to was the real-life development of BLT groups on all continents. And you will see here on the right a photo of Michelle Obama. You can imagine this movement became so huge that someone like a Michelle Obama on this planet Earth could have been seen wearing a BLT baseball cap. This is how huge this movement became. All right? So this also scared some wealthy Iranians, right? It made them afraid, is this going to happen to me? And so it caused quite a bit of social and political change within a period of just a few decades. Within 10 years, the climate inheritance tax that is talked about in this radio drama was passed on 12 countries of Uranus. And since passage, there's been dramatic reduction in pollution and an increase in species protection. Über has been quoted in interviews as saying she's very thankful that now she's been seeing new types of shells of a diversity that she hadn't seen since she started collecting 45 years ago. So this is a very interesting case of fiction leading fairly directly to political change. The second piece I want to talk to is written by Queerbird, and this is a piece of flash fiction called Pit Stop. Now, Queerbird is a mixed media artist, and she was interested in questioning what's natural, what's identity, but she was also very critical of technology. And in this flash fiction piece, she envisions the transformation of what we might consider a gas station. It's a mobile fuel station, so for filling Uranian modes of transport. They're not exactly cars, but you can imagine that they're similar to cars. And what she envisions is the transformation of this space over 13 generations. So in the beginning, this is the hot new thing. It allows us technologically to do something we couldn't do before, right? To be mobile, not with our own energy. That's amazing. Then over time, it becomes taken for granted. And then after that, it becomes barren, as maybe people don't need to drive cars anymore. And what Über imagines is the step beyond this, a utopian step. What happens to this gas station after we don't need cars anymore? And she imagines basically a colorful, rainbow-colored interspecies rave taking over this space. So what's interesting about this is it led to the creation of pit stops in several settlements where old technologies were repurposed meaningfully in a new space. So you can imagine kind of an old Shell gas station being repurposed as some amazing rainforest utopia, right? Also interesting is that Queerbird herself became a very useful thinker on how to transform these spaces and how to reimagine technologies. So she became a lecturer at Klauke University, which is very prestigious on Uranus. And she's currently developing a program on de-technological transformation, or rewilding. Now these, in future research, it would be very interesting to begin to translate her texts on rewilding, because that could be very interesting for us in the kinds of transformation that we need right now as we're going from a fossil fuel-based society to something else. The final piece I want to talk about, and I have enough time, fortunately, is gentrification ice cream. So this, of course, is a perfect example of why it's so difficult to translate from other planets and other universes into our context, but this is my best attempt. So Gentrification Ice Cream was a novel written by Stargazer, who, inspired by Queerbird, wanted to deal with breaking down and reimagining identity. She was not so interested in technological spaces. She was interested in language itself. So what she did was she took words that were loaded with meaning on Uranus, like gentrification here, and she shot them through with completely different, absurd new meanings. Okay, so gentrification ice cream is a really delicious ice cream that's a mix of fruits with a nut swirl within it. So this completely changes the idea of gentrification. It doesn't meet it in any way that we could think of it, right? What she also was really good at doing, it's kind of like spaghetti ice, I think of, as an American living in Germany. What she also did is she took a lot of nonsense words and infused those with meaning to try to get at different ethical principles. So here what we saw is different nonsense words that were filled with meanings promoting respect. What does it mean to respect other species? What does it mean to have a species identity that might just have one species in it, or that might have several different species within it? And so what's very interesting here is she used language to promote a discussion on something that until then had really been implicit, right? That we kind of all have our idea of what identity might mean, but in creating these nonsense words, she forces us to talk about it, right? To have an exchange of ideas. So what does all this mean? I thought I'd give you a couple takeaways of the initial findings of this research. First, and I think most importantly perhaps, is that utopian visions, they can prime us or they can jolt us into new ways of thinking, right? They take us completely out of the tracks of our mind that we're on before, right? If we think of gentrification as an ice cream and not as a type of urban change, it makes us see the world in a new way, and it might make new ideas possible, right? Drag utopias can also build support for new ideas, or they can normalize solutions. So here we see with BLT, a particular policy solution that never probably could have been presented in the Senate was presented instead in the form of fiction, became a social movement, and in that way was passed politically. And this leads me to the final point, which is that in rare cases, fictional visions can lead directly to political change. So this makes them especially interesting to study. So I'm done with my talk. I have a question for you, but I'm sure you have many questions for me. Thank you.
A round of applause for Lisa.